today's guest is an addiction counselor. Her name is Marianne Palmer, and we actually met in person. And the reason I wanted her on is because I know that a lot of times in our community, people dealing with difficult, there you are, Marianne, people dealing with difficult themselves, but their children are really affected. And addiction is a
There we
big
go.
part. Yay!
Yeah.
Addiction is a big part of our world. Again, not only in ourselves and our exes, but with our children. And so Marianne is a member of the Been There, Got Out Club with this kind of thing herself. So she really understands deeply the experience of people going through that. Plus, she's an expert because she helps people with all of this. But before we even get started, Marianne, can you first talk about why the word addict is shaming? Because I didn't realize that. We always say if someone's an addict, they have an issue. Like, why is that shaming to say someone's an
It's
addict?
because there is so much stigma out there. If you call someone an addict, you're describing that describes that whole person. They identify as addict. They are a person who has an addiction. And so we use the word substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder instead.
Yeah,
It's
really good to know.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know, and I didn't mean to shame anybody by saying, we know
No,
someone's an addict.
a lot of it's a slow change. It's more and more people are switching the language. Everyone in the addiction field has switched the language, but it's slowly going out into the communities.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. Now, can you first introduce yourself and say what you are exactly and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Marianne C. Palmer, and I am a certified parent coach. And as you mentioned earlier, I am the mother of a son in long-term sobriety. And I work with parents. I coach parents to and moms and dads whose children are struggling with substance or alcohol use and other behaviors as well. The approach I use works for behaviors outside of addiction, such as an eating disorder or oppositional behavior,
Yeah.
among other things.
So, are people predisposed to, can I say addiction or substance use? Like, what should I say?
You could say addiction because it's
Okay.
not. It's a condition. It's not who the person is.
Okay.
So
All
in
right.
that
So, are
in that
people
context, we're good.
Okay, good. That's enough. All right. So, are people predisposed to addiction or addictive
They can
behaviors?
be.
Okay.
About half of people who have substance use disorder are genetically predisposed. The numbers range from like 40% to 60%, but it's really hard to nail down because there are so many contributing factors for
Yeah.
when a substance abuse issue happens. But genetics are not destiny. It it doesn't have to become. You don't have to necessarily have a problem with alcohol or other drugs, but there are contributing factors that can tilt the scales in that direction,
Mm-hmm.
such as mental health issues. Again, about half of people with addiction have a co-occurring disorder. It might be anxiety, depression, ADHD, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Oh boy,
And
that's very common in this community.
yeah, that sort of thing. It is very common in that community, and it also doesn't mean because you have those factors that you are going to develop, even if you are genetically predisposed and you have issues around contributing factors from the family, doesn't necessarily mean it's you're going to get addicted. You're predisposed to it for sure. But again, there are so many influences that it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a relief to hear just because our children might be genetically predisposed to it, that it's not necessarily going to be doomed for their future.
Right, especially if the family is aware of it and address the issue, talk to the child, and understand what's going on with them, because you could head it off. You can certainly influence. You don't have complete control, but you can have influence over what's going on with your kids.
Well, that's what I love, is because there's so many things that are out of our control. So I love learning, and we'll get into it later, ways that we as parents and people can influence our children and others to hopefully not fall into this. So
Right.
what are some criteria that determine if someone really has a problem?
Well, there are a few things that a few ways I can answer this question. There are stages of addiction, and so we can look at that and maybe have just a general understanding of how addiction develops first. So the initial stage is you start using, and it could be just social drinking. I mean, if they're kids, they're underage, they shouldn't be drinking, but that's going to happen. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have a problem. And then some do go on to have an issue, and that is the abuse stage. That's the second phase. And then you start seeing more binge drinking, more frequent use in general. It still doesn't mean there's going to be a problem, but it's a warning sign. And if the child or young adult is using a substance such as an opioid, heroin, fentanyl, meth, even the first time they're using it, that's abuse. It's not like going out and having a cocktail with friends or having a beer in somebody's basement, which we don't want to see, but that happens. Doesn't necessarily mean you've got a problem.
What about cocaine?
Yeah, cocaine is an illicit drug, so not a good idea. That's not like that's beyond the normal usage, that you see in a social setting.
Interesting. I just thought of something. I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, that if somebody has blackouts, that they have a problem. Can you talk about that? We didn't talk about this before, but I just thought about it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Blackouts are bad.
Okay,
Blackouts mean
tell us about blackouts.
blackouts mean you have a problem. You've had enough to drink, so that it has affected your brain to the point where you can't remember what happened. So if you are having blackouts, or if you see if your child is having blackouts, it's time to get some help.
Wow. Okay. And then you mentioned binge drinking, and I'm wondering, with binge drinking, is that when someone drinks a lot at once?
Yep.
Like they just can't stop drinking in one sitting, or is it where they go on a binge for, say, several days at a time? Like, which is binge, or is it both?
They're both binge. So yeah. So if you're drinking for 5 days, that's also not a good sign.
Okay. All right. Now, we talked a lot about the brain and how you said that addiction can hijack the brain, the reward system in the brain. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So what happens is when you use a drug for the first time, or I think I used the example of you go to grandma's house and there's this amazing chocolate cake. And that chocolate cake, you eat it, and it gives you a big rush of dopamine because it's so good. And we're hardwired to appreciate food and things that keep us alive. And so the brain, the non-thinking part of the brain, goes ahead and stores all the memories associated with that chocolate cake so that you can get it again. And that non-thinking part of the brain will get triggered when, so you're at grandma's, you remember where you were, what it smelled like, who you were with. And so the next time you go to grandma's house, you're going to want a piece of chocolate cake. And this is what happens in the brain with a substance. And that's why we are concerned about people when they're trying to get sober, being triggered by people, places, and things, because they're all triggers that haven't really, you get that trigger before your thinking brain even knows it's happening. So it's really hard to deal with.
Yeah, so what you described, it almost sounds like a positive memory where all of your senses are engaged and there's associations with that particular thing, like chocolate. I mean, even as you said it, I was like, oh, I want a chocolate
Yeah,
cake. Like being
right,
very suggestive,
right.
suggestible.
Yeah. So it's the non-thinking part of the brain. And, for us, getting that piece of chocolate cake, next time we're triggered, it could be, well, I had a lot of sugar today, so I'm not going to have it. They do not have, someone who is addicted does not have that choice, because in addiction, the limbic system, the non-thinking brain, bypasses the prefrontal cortex. So they find themselves just hunting it down and not thinking, I really shouldn't do this. They just don't have that capability. So when someone is using and you think, why can't they just stop?
Mhm.
They can't.
Yeah, yeah. As you're saying that, it's making me think of the parallels between addiction and trauma bonding. When people say, well, why doesn't that person just leave an abuser? It's because your brain has already been rewired.
Yes. It's like it's drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we talked about physical addiction. Does someone have to be physically addicted to have a problem with substances?
No. No, that's where you get into the stages. So we did abuse, and then what happens next is tolerance. So you just need more of whatever your drug of choice is to get the same effect. So that's when the brain starts to be compromised.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next phase is dependency. And that's when you can't feel pleasure without the drug. So you're solely focused on getting that drug. It doesn't mean you're physically addicted at that point, but that's the next phase. So that final phase of addiction is physical and psychological dependence. And at that point, it's a full-blown mental health disorder.
That's so interesting. I've never heard that before, where you said that someone can't feel pleasure except if
Yeah,
they're using.
yeah, it's
Wow.
called an anhedonic response.
So, so someone who's an addict, basically, I'm thinking of the things that they enjoyed or got happiness from, people, pets, whatever, activities that it's almost like they
Community,
can't.
community,
Right,
right.
right.
They're not getting the simple life affirming pleasures anymore, because the dopamine in their brains, the receptors, are getting filled by drugs. So there's not room for the simple pleasure dopamine to get in there, because the dopamine from having dinner with your family, when that was something very pleasurable,
Mm-hmm.
fills in the receptors. Um, so the I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. So the simple pleasures fill in the dopamine receptors, but something like a drug floods the dopamine receptors. So you can't compare the pleasure.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I imagine that that relates a lot to isolation when someone has a problem.
Yes, because when someone has a problem, one of the criteria for judging how bad the problem is how much time they spend thinking about the drug, getting the drug, taking the drug, and then planning the next fix.
Mm-hmm.
As they just keep cycling through that. So there's really little room left over
Yeah,
for
I'm just thinking
having.
all
Yeah,
consuming.
it's all consuming.
Yeah. What about teenagers? So is there something that happens in the teenage years that relates to addiction?
Yeah. So um, the if a child 15 or younger starts using, they have a 5 time greater chance of developing an addiction than someone who waited until they were 21.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's because the brain's not developed yet. So the brain is getting compromised.
Yeah, and that immediately makes me think of laws, where when laws are relaxed and
Mm-hmm.
kids have easier access to drugs, the impact that it can have on our society.
Right. Marijuana becoming legal can be a real problem
Yeah.
because
Wow.
It's easy access, and it's not the marijuana of many years ago. It's a lot stronger, and it causes issues.
If someone is using, does it always get worse? Like if you see it happening, is it just like predetermined, like this is going to get really bad?
No.
That's the surprise.
Yeah, because, well, think of somebody who's drinking, people that that go out and have cocktail with dinner. It doesn't mean that they're going to go on to have an alcohol use disorder.
Mm-hmm.
But like with any disease, best caught early. So you want to intervene in those early stages as soon as you realize there's a problem.
All right. So speaking of problems, a lot of times we don't want to believe that there's a problem for a number of reasons.
Denial.
Like about denial. Like everything is fine.
Yeah. Well, we're on a parallel track with these kids as parents because they're in denial. They're just having fun. I don't have a problem. I can stop anytime I want. And the parent really, well, it's hard to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Was he using? Was he not using? And also, we don't want it to be true.
Mm-hmm.
Almost every parent I speak with has started in denial, including myself. And the go-to is, I can fix this, I can control it. And as parents, that makes sense. That's what we've been doing with our kids since they were babies, being in charge. But that doesn't work. With my son, I thought, I'll take him to the doctor. I'll take him to a psychiatrist. I took him to meetings, sent him to rehab, got all kinds of medication, and I thought this is going to do it. And when it didn't, I thought, well, if I do it all one more time, maybe it'll work this time. But it doesn't. It doesn't. The child has to own the addiction. We can't do it for them.
Yeah, that's what we want to call
Yeah,
this. I can't do it
right.
for you.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, like I'm thinking of the term, it's relational, but like codependency. So here you are, this is your child, you raise them, you love them more than anything, and you want to help them.
Yep.
And you can't, and you're doing everything possible. How do you deal with that yourself? How does something like this affect your own identity and self-esteem, having a child, whatever age, who has a problem with substances?
Yeah, it's really hard on a parent. You tend to blame yourself. But you didn't cause it. And, in this community with difficult parental relationships, I could see where people would blame themselves. But it's, if you stayed in the relationship and didn't get a divorce, it could have happened anyway, and most likely would have. So, what was the first? Could you repeat the question?
That's okay.
I
So we were
strayed a little bit.
that's okay. So we were talking about some misconceptions, and denial is one of
Yeah,
them. And then I started
yes.
thinking
Like,
how it affects your self-esteem as a parent without being able to fix it. If I can't fix it for you, then
right.
what am I supposed to do while I'm living with this and watching my child suffer
Yes.
and blaming myself, and the impact it has on the rest of your life and your own relationships? I imagine that, like the issue in our community with domestic violence, that there's a lot of shame, self-blame, and feeling like you can't talk to other people about it because they'll think, well, you must be a bad parent because why does your child have a problem like that?
Yeah,
Must be you.
that's right. That's rampant. And therefore, people don't talk about it
Mm-hmm.
and don't get support. And you really need support in a situation like this. When my son was going through this, I didn't have support for a long time. And once I got it, it really made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So while we can't fix it, we can influence it. But in order to influence it, we have to help the child think it through rather than telling them what to do. Because, it's like Lucy and Charlie Brown listening to the teacher and what the lecturing, and what they hear is wow, 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 wow.
Right.
That's what they hear from us too. And again, it's like, okay, I said this 100 times. If I say it 101, he's going to get it this time. But they don't. So there are skills. I use a method called CRAFT. It's an acronym. It stands for Community Reinforcement and Family Treatment. And the goal is to develop connection with your kid and to speak to them in a way that they can hear you, and give them positive reinforcement and understanding what they're going through, because they don't want to be there either. That doesn't mean you condone anything, but you start using these skills and you start to see a difference. I know I did with my own son. I really didn't start using these skills until later in his addiction, and he had been sober for about a year. He was living with me. It was a holiday, and he was down in a bedroom in the basement, and I was up doing dishes. He came up around 2 o'clock in the morning, drunk, and was shocked to find me there. What I normally would have done was gone into my routine. How can you do this? You've been sober for a year. The whole thing. And that's what I would have done. But I had started developing these skills. It's important to pause and not just fly off the handle, and think through how you're going to handle it and what you're going to say. And also, you don't talk to them when they've been using, because they're not in their right mind. So I just said to him, we're going to talk tomorrow night, and you just go back down to bed. I took him downstairs. I covered him to let him know this was going to be different. I wasn't just going to scream at him, because that would have done nothing. So the next night, I sat down with him, and all my planning, the only thing I said to him was, Michael, you seem to be struggling. And it was such a relief, because that was what was happening with him. And
he said that, right? He
yeah,
acknowledged it.
he acknowledged it, and he said, oh, I've got so much going on. And he just started saying all these things that he was worried about. And then instead of telling him what he should do, I said, what do you want to do about it? And he said, well, I think I'll start going back to my meetings, and I need to see my sponsor. And he went ahead and did that. And so that's an example of it going really well. And it takes a little while to get there. It's kind of hit and miss for a while, until you get used to speaking this way, and until the child gets used to you speaking to them in that manner. But, it's like magic when it works.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the term white knuckling. What does white
Okay.
knuckling mean?
White knuckling means just trying to go cold turkey, stopping drugs and substances without any support or plan. I'm just going to stop, and with no, no help at all. And the brain's going crazy. You may be going through withdrawal, or the cravings just might be really bad. And it's kind of a recipe for failure. Going back, I mean, I'm sure there are some people have been successful with that, but it's really, that would be rare.
Yeah. Is that the term dry drunk as well?
No, dry drunk is when you have been sober and you're not drinking, but you still have the behaviors associated with drinking. You may
Can
still
you
be
talk about
lying.
that?
Yeah,
Lying.
you may still be lying. You may be hiding things. You may have the temper that you had when you were drinking. All those undesirable behaviors that go along with alcohol and drug abuse are still there. And that also comes from not getting any kind of support when you're getting sober, because you really have to look at it and understand it, to understand yourself, know why
We
you were.
talked. Go ahead.
I was going to say, know why you got into it in the first place. What was it? There's always something. There's always something that when you pick up that first drink, it fixes it.
Yeah. So I was going to say, we talked about the difference between abstinence, sobriety, and recovery.
Yes.
Tell us about
So,
that.
so abstinence means you don't drink at all. Sobriety, and recovery are really the same thing. I mean, you wouldn't say you were sober if you never drank to begin with. It's a process of stopping to use, and recovery is the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I remember you said something about how abstinence is the opposite of harm reduction. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Talk about
Yes.
harm
Right.
reduction, because I had never heard that term before
Yeah.
either.
So harm reduction is, say you have a child who's using heroin, which is a pretty scary thing, especially with fentanyl out there. I just read this morning that fentanyl was on the rise again after having uh, not, been surprisingly lower incidence of ODing on it over the past few months. So I'm sorry, I lost my
That's okay.
train.
Harm reduction.
Harm
What is harm
reduction, yeah.
reduction?
So you want to keep your kid alive. So total abstinence would be you use nothing at all, sort of like cold turkey. And harm reduction is they're not quite ready, but if they're willing to smoke marijuana instead of doing heroin, that's a win.
Mm-hmm. So it's progress.
It's progress. Yeah, it's making progress. It's a good way of putting it. And less harmful substances.
Yeah. One of the things you said that I thought was really fascinating in the past was that relapse is part of the recovery process. Talk about what relapse is and why we shouldn't completely freak out if there's a slip.
Yeah. Well, the example I gave of my son, that relapse was a year after he'd been sober. And there are, like, those first 2 years, there are points where your brain is not quite healed from having been addicted to alcohol. And there are points at 3 months, 6 months, a year, and 2 years where you're particularly vulnerable to triggers and until that swelling subsides. And so, it's harder to not pick up a drink or to use.
How common is it for someone who's been sober for several years to have a relapse?
The longer out you go, the better shot you have. But also, if you do, I mean, you hear people sober 10 years and, and they suddenly pick up. Typically, they deal with it and get back on track after they've been out that far. But it's hard. It's a lifelong disease because those neural networks are in your brain, and you can put them. They can recede, but they're always going to be there. They don't go away.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, I can already guess, but what do you think about when people say we need to do an intervention?
Well, I think there are all kinds of feelings about intervention. Some people feel unless they do it, the child does it themselves, that it's not going to work. But it has been shown that it does work. Even if this kid's going to kill themselves, or they're really in harm's way, you do an intervention to get them someplace and get them help. And, it can work.
Okay. I mean, when I think intervention, I think of a group of people sitting in a circle in chairs, almost like a bad surprise party for someone walking.
That's a good way of putting it. It's a bad surprise party.
Yeah. But I mean, does it actually, so those actually work? I mean, it's like you see them in movies where people are sitting around and then.
Yeah, it's not like the television shows, the I don't remember what they were called, but that show was called, it's not like that.
Okay.
But, sometimes it's necessary. The craft approach could be used to move somebody towards getting help without having to do the interventions. And they get to that point where, I'm ready. I want to try something. And, you don't want to wait for them to hit rock bottom, because rock bottom is a really scary place. A lot of people are told, well, you can't do anything, let them hit rock bottom. But these days, especially with fentanyl, rock bottom can be death.
Yeah.
So, if you can avoid that, that's the better way to go.
Yeah. What about other tips? So you talked about CRAT, C-R-A-T. I thought you said crap at first. C-R-A-T. Um, what,
Craft,
so let's,
C-R-A-F-T, yeah,
oh, okay.
craft.
So let's talk about some other tips and skills that parents or people can use when they have a child who has a substance use disorder or alcohol problem.
Okay, so the craft approach is like taking one step at a time, putting together like this whole program where you're approaching your child from different angles. So communication, I just gave one example with my son. Um, Setting boundaries and setting boundaries that are based on the parents' values, because
Mm-hmm.
that's why it's bothering you so much, because it's violating your values over and over again.
Mm.
So an example of that might be, and it's always good to work with the actual situation that the family is going through. So if your child continues to miss curfew, it's time to put a boundary around that. And that could look like, I always find what would work for that particular family, but what it might look like is, if you come home, you tell them ahead of time that this has been an issue. And it's really upsetting for me. I worry about you. I don't know what's happened to you. The next time you don't make it home, I'm going to have to take the car keys for a couple of weeks or whatever it is. But
Mm-hmm.
you work with the parent and find out what the thing is that it is right for that family. So that's an example of setting a boundary. Another thing that needs to be done, and it's hard to do, is letting them suffer the consequences of
Mm-hmm.
their use and not keep protecting them. I know I did that for a long time. I couldn't bear for my son to go through some of the things he was going to go through, like had a DUI, keeping him out of jail. And I did it because I couldn't live with it. But for the most part, like, if he's going to be late for school, you don't call for him and give an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
You could start with the smaller things that are easier to live with, or call a boss if he's going to miss work. And then those, that lifestyle starts to become a little complicated for them, and it gets them to start thinking, boy, I'm tired of living this way.
Yeah, so it's not just hard for them, it's hard for you
It
as a parent
is.
to
It
not put on that
is.
superhero cape and say, I'm gonna save my child. I'm gonna at least save this part. It's better not to.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I always tell parents, if it is something you can't live with, this means he's going to be in harm's way. You can decide, I can't live with that.
Mm-hmm.
But go ahead and let all the consequences happen. Positive reinforcement. These kids are not happy. They don't want this. And they feel really bad about themselves. They're embarrassed. The bravado covers it up, but they really do not feel good about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to kind of water the flowers and not the weeds. So the
Mm-hmm.
consequences are the weeds. Let them go. Let
Yeah.
them have those consequences, but also let them know how great they are. You got to catch them doing something right. Sometimes it's easier than others. A child could be so miserable that it's hard to find the thing to compliment them on. So you just,
Mm-hmm.
you catch a smile and you compliment that. And you just keep growing that. Another thing I mentioned earlier is understanding how they got there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and um, it could be something as simple as that's not so simple, it's terrible, being bullied at school.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could be, PTSD from trauma in the home. But
Yeah.
this is, the drug becomes their refuge, and you have to understand that. It's not
Mm.
okay, but I get how hard it is for you.
That's an important word, refuge, because we often talk about kids that grow up in a home where domestic violence is present, that it feels like a war zone. It's
Yeah.
actually worse because home is supposed to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you talk about refuge, I'm thinking that makes perfect sense. Not to excuse it, but that a kid would of course turn to something else to find that peace.
Right. And if that's what it's like at home, it's hard to get that kind of support.
Mm-hmm.
That, to say, yeah, I get what you're going through.
Yeah.
That goes a long way. And it doesn't have to be a parent. It could be someone else. It could be a teacher, a coach,
Mm-hmm.
another, a friend's dad or mom. But as long as they have somebody that they can turn to, somebody they know they can count on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you talked about some other communication tips that have acronyms. ANTS. Can you say what ANTS is?
ASS?
No, ANTS.
Ants.
Yeah,
I do know that. I didn't mention that because I don't know it off the top of my
I
head.
do, because you told me and I
Okay.
wrote it down. Automatic negative thought patterns. Or
Oh,
negative, yeah,
okay.
automatic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Um, I don't want to. I mean, kind of the name says what it is, but
Mm-hmm.
you could have that for both parent and the child. It's like, the child walks in the door and you don't like the way they look. You may be right or wrong, and then you automatically go to these negative thoughts.
Mm,
Child could do the same thing.
yeah. Yeah. I think about your example of your son coming upstairs and not expecting to see you when he had been drinking after being sober for a year. And then, like, you could have just launched into him. He could have started fighting back with you, but you changed it.
Yeah,
You changed the tide.
I changed the trajectory
Hmm.
of what could have happened.
Yeah. And another one that you had mentioned before was stop, the STOP.
Okay. So that's also what I did
Hmm.
when he came up into the kitchen. I had I had to stop and think. You hit the pause button,
Hmm.
and that makes such a huge difference because you respond instead of react.
Yeah, I wrote down that STOP each stands for something. The S is for stop, T is for take a breath, O is for observe your body without judgment, and then the
Yeah,
P is plan or proceed how to respond
right. So it
properly.
was the example of my son is right. I think you may have known that acronym and put it down when I was talking about this
Yeah,
process.
I
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
I was like, yeah, so there's all these acronyms. But this has been so helpful, Marianne. Can you talk a little bit about like what you can do for people? Because it's right before the holidays, and I imagine this is a very stressful time of year for
The,
people because there's all kinds of expectations as well as
right.
all kinds of temptations.
Yeah. So the holidays can really suck when you have addiction in the family and all, whatever else is going on in your community. I'm sorry, this is swaying. Um, so when I work with parents, I do it remotely on Zoom, and then I sell packages of 6 sessions because it's really hard to accomplish much in less than that.
Mm-hmm.
But right now I'm running a special for the holidays just because it is so very hard. And it's good to have somebody kind of by your side helping you figure out how to negotiate this time of year. For
Yeah.
example, really good if a kid's just coming home for the holidays to have a contract done ahead of time saying these are the expectations and this is what will happen if those expectations aren't met, but you decide it together. So the child, again, it's not like coming at them. It's like, okay, so this really upsets me if you don't come home at night. What can we do about that? What should be the consequence? And it works better if the child has input.
Yeah.
So it's that
And
kind of thing that I would work with parents on. So the
yeah,
and so it's a special. I don't think I said this. It's $50 a session for
that's amazing.
now through November,
Yeah.
January 2nd.
All right. And so, how can people find you? I'll put your handle at the bottom, in
Yes,
our
and
little description.
I have all my links
Hmm.
on the Instagram account. But you could go to my website if you want to write this down. It's Maryann, MaryAnnC Palmer, PALMER.com, and you'll see the holiday special there. You'll also find it through Instagram.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Maryann. I had a feeling when we met that you would be great with all this information, because I really learned a lot just from talking to you today and the last time that we talked
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. No, I enjoyed all our talks in this, especially.
Yeah. All right. So thanks again, and happy holidays.
Okay, same to you.
All right. Take
Bye.
care. Bye.